Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to today's webinar on South Africa's energy outlook, where a panel of experts will unpack what to expect regarding Eskom's restructuring, new generation investment, grid expansion, and strategies for local content. Today's webinar is brought to you by EY Parthenon, MDA Attorneys, Nordex, Actum, Sungro, and Engie. We thank them for their support in making this webinar possible. Before we get started, please be aware that we've enabled the Q&A function, so please post any questions into the Q&A box. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will answer as many of your questions as possible throughout the discussion. To encourage interaction, we've also enabled the chat function, so you can network with the panelists via the chat box. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please remember not to post any questions in the chat box, though, as we may miss them. Post those into the Q&A instead. Please be aware we are recording this webinar and will send the recording to you when it's available. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Paul O'Flaherty from EY Parthenon. Prior to joining EY Parthenon, he held several CFO and CEO roles in listed companies, as well as in the public sector and family-owned businesses, where he's played a key role in successful turnarounds, mergers and acquisitions, and project management. Paul has industry experience in mining, infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, trading, steel, and financial services, and has worked in South Africa, across Africa, as well as in the Middle East. Paul will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which includes James Mackay, CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa, Vaughan Hutting, Director at MDA Attorneys, Bernard Magoro, Head of the IPP Office, Compton Saunders, MD of Nordex, and Mamiki Matlawa, Group Business Development Executive at Actum. I'll hand over now to our facilitator, Paul O'Flaherty, to continue with the proceedings. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, and good afternoon, everybody, and special welcome to the panelists. This topic is really broad, and when we talk about Eskom restructuring, the recent changes to the grid connections, the South Africa's Just Energy Transition Plan, so many topics to unpack. But what we thought we'd do is maybe focus a little bit on three key areas and debate those areas. The one which is top of mind, late last year, you would have seen the latest or the draft Integrated Resource Plan of 23, which came out for public comment to replace the IRP of 2019. That's definitely worth a debate. Big swings in some of the allocations. The second part is grid constraints. Evacuating of power is a big issue in South Africa and actually, particularly around the transmission lines. And thirdly, enablement, and particularly for the private sector. So we'll unpack some of those issues and touch on some of the other issues that Shannon spoke about. So let me start with the IRP. So if you look at the Integrated Resource Plan, the draft one for 2023, significant changes in mix here. A big focus on security of supply. An estimate that over the next 4 years, we will still have elements of load shedding. For the first time, it's gone into a 2 horizon, so an allocation of what's required by 2030, but then a window thereafter. Obviously, a big change in the mix of allocations, particularly longer life for the coal power stations, far less emphasis on wind, in fact, significant drop in that, and we'll talk about it. But a big uptake in embedded generation or distributed generation, which is self-generation. So perhaps let me start off with James. James has over 20 years of experience in public and private sector, significant experience in the energy sector, and as Shannon said, current CEO of the Energy Council. So James, off the bat, your impression of IRP 23 and an indication that for the next 4 years, we'll still have load shedding. Do you think it's good enough? Do you think there's more we can do?
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon to all the listeners online. Maybe two very important questions, and we might have to make a little bit of separation between them. I think we can come back and chat about the IRP. I see some real positives that we can build on from IRP 23. Certainly, as you've said, Horizon 1 has brought better shorter-term focus. I think that there's emphasis on the interventions around taking action. So certainly like accelerating gas and some of those, the TDP, those are all important. I also think that there is what we've seen is a very different response out of government over 2023, and the business government partnership has sort of really emphasized that. And the IRP 23 has sort of made a firm commitment to engage with business and in general with society around what is the pathway of the future for our energy sector. So certainly there are things which I think can be corrected and updated, maybe not corrected. But there's a lot of in areas where maybe old data has been used, those need to be improved, old TDP, old GCCA, some old CapEx numbers. But I think we've got to maybe, get into use the opportunity to engage in the IRP. And I think there's a lot that we can take from it. But the IRP paints really essentially a very, very conservative outlook of an energy sector. But I don't think the data is necessarily wrong. And that then emphasizes the fact that we've got to engage on it. I think that probably the more important question on top of mind, Paul, is actually load shedding. I think that there's a huge amount of work that went into, again, the business government partnership, the Energy Action Plan, NECOM last year, in setting that foundation to really focus on how do we get more clarity, understanding around ending load shedding, which is being framed under the president's meetings. And he has those in-person meetings with business ministers and CEOs on a 6-weekly basis. And I think that's really giving a lot more confidence as to where we will move with load shedding. We can come back to the details, but I think that at the moment there's been a significant, at the tail end of last year, a lot of scenario planning and detailed modeling around the critical areas being what will happen to EAF, what will happen to new generation over now 24 going into 25, and then some of the key enablers and sort of important directional shifts which we see in the reform. I think that the output of that work and the engagements at the moment, there's 3 days of energy action labs going on at Eskom. I was there most of this morning, is I think that there's a more confident view that if we take a 2-year view, we can end load shedding. So in 2024, we have enough new generation coming online. If we look at rooftop, utility, solar and wind, the standard offer out of Eskom is contracted just over a gig of new power, imports also a gig of power. And if we can just stabilize EAF in 2024, essentially that will get us to sort of stage 1 of load shedding by the end of 2024. Then 2025, we've got to focus on recovering reserve margin, improving reliability, and really getting that energy security back into the system. So there will be some kind of big communications coming out, I think, jointly out of government and business, but there is a positive outlook. I think from a societal perspective, we can say we can end load shedding effectively by the end of this year, but really bearing in mind that there are risks, there's a lot of work to be done. And then we've got to build on top of that the reliability and the reserve margin that the system needs in 2025. So I think that that's my view, but happy to dive into the details a little bit later. Thanks.
No, thanks, James. That's very positive, I think, from some of the meetings you've been having at Eskom. Perhaps, Vaughan, the next one for you. Vaughan, who's the director of MDA Attorneys, a significant commercial experience, particularly in the energy sector. Vaughan, one of the big highlights in this integrated resource plan is the self-generation and connecting to the grid, so distributed generation. And one of the issues that is an issue, and maybe you can unpack it for us, is that all generators who wish to be grid tied and have an installed capacity over 1 megawatt require a specific guarantee. So over and above construction work guarantees, etc., for what you build, there's a specific potential liability. Perhaps you can unpack that a little bit for us, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone, panelists and participants. Yes, Paul, it's there are a couple of issues that come to the fore when one looks at these guarantees that necessary for we'll just call them generators to provide in order to secure grid connection. And I think besides the mechanics of the guarantee itself, one also has to look at and consider, especially I think in light of one of James's comments earlier, that the IRP 23 encourages a strong commitment to engage. And I agree with him, and having looked at read and considered the IRP 23, I think that's a fundamentally important shift and focus. But one of the things for me, and as an attorney, that this goes hand in hand with, is engagement with contractors, and engagement in this instance with generators, particularly for them to tie into the grid. And the form of the guarantee that's required by Eskom, which, as you mentioned, goes hand in hand and runs in tandem to a large extent with any contract works guarantee, is this grid capacity allocation guarantee, both of which are on-demand guarantees. And I think that, for me, also informs the approach generally that Eskom takes to its contracting and engagement, at least on a contractual level with contractors. The on-demand guarantee is it's a typical instrument to secure performance by contractors generally. But and I don't think in this instance it goes beyond what is typically understood, but it raises the question of whether or not and to what extent this onerous type of guarantee is indeed necessary. And in my experience with contracting and contractors generally, this form of guarantee, it's, as I say, it's onerous, but at the same time informs a wider point and philosophy. It exposes that philosophy towards contracting generally, and that is towards an adversarial form of contracting, an adversarial engagement with contractor and generators in this instance. And that, I think, is something that needs to be addressed throughout, and not only in the context of guarantees, but generally in the contracting forms and the contract requirements, particularly in this instance with the self-build type arrangements that generators are expected to sign. So I think that needs to be addressed in a broader context. It's a difficult question, and has been debated in many forums in many employer organizations. But I do think that with a strong focus on engaging and commitment to engage, I think that is one of the areas that needs to be looked at, particularly by both Eskom and its contractors and generators. And I think looking and taking a different view, perhaps on the adversarial forms of contracting and types of guarantees that we encounter, may also go some of the way to assisting in that engagement and making it more productive.
Yeah, thanks, Vaughan, and we'll come back to that particular issue. And there are some questions in the chat there. My next one is for Compton, as Shannon said, MD of Nordics Energy, but Compton also has board roles in the South African Wind Energy Association, and he chairs the Manufacturing and Local Content Working Group in the Wind Energy Association. Compton, when I unpacked the previous IRP 2018 versus 2019 versus this current one in draft, and I look at the wind allocations to 2030, from around 11,500 in the 2018 IRP to 17,800 in the 2019, and now 8,000 megawatts only from wind. What would you say, Compton, are the biggest challenges for the uptake of wind power, and why do you think these allocations have been revised quite dramatically, I think, in my view?
Thanks, Paul, and afternoon to everybody. Yeah, look, I think Yeah, look, I think the first question is, does wind remain, quite a key part of the energy mix, which I think is indeed the case, right? So from a generation profile perspective, the profile of wind is very well suited to complement that of solar. So it has to remain quite a key generation technology, and therefore, from an uptake perspective, I think we've historically seen as part of the REAP, it's been the dominant renewables technology, and I think we continue to see a similar trend in the private market. So I think from a change in the considerations in REAP, I think there's obviously a number of factors which are contributing to that. I think obviously one of the major constraints generally is just the volume of new generation that could be brought online. I think obviously one of the major factors remains the grid constraint. And I think again, just considering that there's been some adjustment in other technologies in the IRP, and considering all of the various factors, there's been a scaling of wind to accommodate. But I think regardless of that, if we again just come back to outside of the IRP, where I think in the private space we've seen significant volumes of wind procurement continue over the last couple of months. So we've seen the private market develop and either closing or attempting to close quite large volumes of wind. So we'll be seeing some of the biggest wind farms coming online in the country, over the next 2 years. So completely confident it will remain a dominant technology.
Thank you. Thanks, Compton. Next question, I'm going to switch over to Bernard. The last two panelists are Eskom alumni like myself, but let me talk to Bernard, head of the IPP office. Really important job. More than 20 years experience in the energy sectors. Perhaps, and as Compton points out, Bernard, IPPs and renewable IPPs in particular still remain a significant part of the mix, even though some of the allocations potentially have changed. In your experience, in what you've seen in the IPP office, what are some of the key contracting challenges for IPP projects, particularly coming forward, and how can these be navigated, and what are the lessons learned from the rollout of the previous IPPs that are in place? Hi, Bernard.
Apologies, yeah. I was still muted.
No problem.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon to you and the audience that joined us this afternoon. Thanks for inviting us, and thanks for the question. And I think that's the real challenge that we're facing as a country. The bottlenecks that we have seen in the last 3 years. One perhaps must acknowledge that, what we have seen in the last 2-3 years is nothing short of disruptions in South Africa, starting with COVID. Then we had a reform that had to be fast-tracked because of the energy crisis that we had. The demand globally for the same products that we're looking for has also skyrocketed. So it's not just a South African issue. This is what everyone is experiencing all over the world. Just to give you an example, in the UK, they ran a tender process for 5 gigawatt of offshore wind. Nobody submitted the bid. So I know we are always hard at ourselves that we are not closing projects, but it's not just a South African phenomenon. But be that as it may, we do have a challenge. And I think if I can just categorize these challenges into 3 pockets. I think the first one is the grid. And the grid it's not just the capacity issue, it's also the allocation process that we had a system in the past that worked very well. But with the reform that happened with the Schedule 2 relaxation, the model has to be adjusted to be able to accommodate these markets that are developing in parallel. So that one, at least, Eskom has reached a landing. We now have a clear direction in the form of IGA. We also have the gating approach that the regulator is currently evaluating. So hopefully that risk of connection will go away. But the second one, and I think that's the big one, is the transmission capacity. We've got gigawatts and gigawatts of projects in the Cape region that cannot connect because there is no transmission capacity. So we heard yesterday that the Minister of Electricity is going to set up the transmission IPP office equivalent. And I think that's a step in the right direction as well, so that we can get more capacity to connect. But I think we must also acknowledge from last week's bidders conferences that we hosted, everyone kept talking about, or rather we received a lot of questions around what government is doing to unlock the different permits, authorizations, and licenses. And I think that's the one area that I'm glad to hear James talking about the work that's happening between government and the business. And I think NECOM has also made lots of stride in this area with the establishment of the one-stop shop. So if we can get that right, I mean, it still takes 90 days to get a generation license from NERSA, up to 2 years to get an EA. Given where we are now, I think we need to really do something about the one-stop shop and make sure that it's implemented immediately. On our side, we also had some lessons as well, and you'll see in bid window 7 that there has been improvement in the drafting of the RFP to also make sure that the projects close and those that don't close, and then it's clear in terms of the process going forward. We now, for the first time, have a reserve bids process where those projects that fail to close within a prescribed timelines, then we'll get other projects to step in and close. So those are some of the things that we are also implementing on our side to make sure that we can close these projects and get this much needed capacity as soon as possible. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. My next question for Mamiki, who is the Group Business Development Executive at Actom. As I said, Eskom alumni, also has worked for the Industrial Development Corporation. Mamiki, with the private sector hat on, and with these allocations of future generation required, particularly in the IPPs, but as well as the transmission grid and the extensive amount of money that needs to be spent there, how do you think at Actom that localization can best be promoted, and what are the areas specifically where you think we can grow local content faster and quicker?
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone and the listeners. I think what we need to continue doing is to continue with the work that was done by the DTIC when the work around local designation of specific equipment. And I think that work, why we should continue to do that, the importance of that is that it forced manufacturers like ourselves to not only look at how do we localize whatever equipment that we're building, but also bring up the value chain locally. So it would not just be, manufacturing jobs specific to that particular equipment, but the downstream of that particular industry. So that's one way of promoting it. But also ensuring that in areas where we do not have capacity, in a sense, is that the powers that be, instead of opening up to the rest of the market, but insisting that when the rest of the market come to take up these opportunities, there is partnering and transferring of technology so that we continue to industrialize as we have seen what the draft IRP is talking about. So that needs to happen. And I think in a sense of where we are in terms of capacity in locally, South Africa can do balance of plant in renewable energy, without a doubt. And I think we need to continue to be on that trajectory in terms of utilizing equipment locally for the new projects that are coming.
Well, thank you, Nomiki, and we'll come back to some more questions to unpack there. I want to switch the discussion to, all of you have mentioned it in some form, the grid and the constraints around the grid and the management of the grid. And we know through the Eskom restructuring that the transmission company is being unbundled as we speak. But perhaps for you, James, the first one is really, do you think that there are adequate wheeling and trading frameworks being developed that can work between Eskom, local government and private participants? What are your views on that?
Thanks, Paul. If you'd allow me, I think it's important maybe just to give some reframing for the average listener, because we often, as specialists, we get very much involved in all these very technical conversations behind closed doors, and are often not very good at communicating. So I think it's important to just reference the structure of NECOM. It's got these technical work streams. It's been established, to deliver against the energy crisis under the Presidential Energy Action Plan. And a lot of people, as lay people, I think hear blah, blah, blah. There's lack of confidence. There's a lot of distrust in these type of messages. They're not fact-based. And 2023, I think, really challenged that in terms of the business-government engagement relationship and the lead that Business for South Africa and BUSA took on that in being able to say that we can't live here as a country and as an energy sector. We've got to be able to do more. I think the president was extremely bold in welcoming business to directly engage and partner with government. And that's really strengthened, and government have been very sort of responsive and engaging in that. So I think we must be careful of not to just dismiss the past and the lack of confidence in these statements. We must acknowledge that, but then we do need to take a leap of faith and say, well, we've got to move forward, and what is happening at the moment? And then we can ask the question around the confidence in those actions. So I think the answer to sort of the wheeling market codes, the NTCSA development, the ERA amendment bill, all of these are very important reform signals, either from a policy perspective. I think there's firm commitment that the ERA is still going to be going through in the 6th sitting of Parliament. That will be a very important message to business that we are pushing with reform. We're open for private sector investment and sector sort of shifting. The NTCSA board has been sort of appointed a very strong mix of skills and private sector people on there who are going to take their mandates and responsibilities very seriously, and I think drive that out. We've seen, I think, a fantastic choice of new CEO for Eskom, who's going to come in and I think really help stabilize and provide better leadership. I mean, all of these are the sort of the directional strong signals that we're moving in the right direction. Underneath that, certainly within NECOM, there are well progressed efforts around national wheeling, net metering, feed-in tariffs, or something else, new market codes. All of those are being developed. The one-stop shop, I think, is really progressing, is making an impact and a difference. So I think we've got to get better about being able to communicate when will these start hitting the market, how will they be implemented, who is accountable, and what is the impact for the average sort of user and consumer of energy. That I think we've got to be a lot better at. But in short, I think a lot is being done that is going in the right direction, and there is really a much greater degree of accountability and reporting within the NECOM structure. Every 2 weeks, all of these action items get reported into the NAT joints. Also, business participates, so there's better scrutiny. So I think we've got to, we can't unpack it all in a session like this. But I think that there are definitely signals and clear signs that we really are starting to move in the right direction. Well, maybe if I could just chat quickly about grid. One of the things, grid is a critical part of the sort of shift in the transition. I think it's an international message and signal as well. In the context of where we're at the moment, if we look, and again, the IRP, I think, can be updated because it used previous TDP numbers, previous GCCA numbers. So essentially it used a view that there was no more grid capacity available in the Capes and hence lower wind. It also used a sort of a softer or lower TDP kind of target. If we currently take, I think the BQ sort of allocation and applications that I have it out of Eskom is about 16 gigawatts. Curtailment, I think, will go ahead. I think there's a lot of progress that should be announced. That's another 4 gigawatts in the Capes. And if we see last year, we put rooftop PV between residential C&I 2.5 gigs from September 22 to September 23. If one just looks at that, which aligns exactly with the Eskom assessment of ready projects that can be delivered in the next 3 years, they came out at 20.6 gigawatts. Those numbers align that we can, industry, and I think organizations, like Nordics and Actum, we must push hard because we can invest and build 26 gigawatts of wind and solar in the next 3 years. And by 2030, if we can make sure that we have confidence in the delivery of the TDP, that will bring another 32.6 gigawatts of capacity available by 2030. So in theory, we can go through this transition. We've got to make sure that we are resourcing those programs, holding them to account and delivering the timelines. I would like to raise a point, though, to Bernard as well, and I think this is also an important point in the IRP. If we are going to start accelerating that type of rooftop, 2.5 gigs a year, and that type of utility and private sector investment, we have to catch up on gas to power and BESS, battery storage. And I think I was very pleased to see that emphasis come through both in the IRP as well as in the IPP office. So I think that there are other things in an integrated systems view that we've got to think a little bit more carefully about than just only what are the gigawatts available on the grid, because I think that those bottlenecks are closer than sometimes what people realize. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'm going to move to a couple of questions, Compton, for you. That there's a couple of questions around the wind and touching a little bit on what James said, and it's really some of the people watching this saying, what is the true potential for wind? There's quotes here of 25 gigawatts to 60 gigawatts. In your view and for the work that you do, what do you believe the true potential is for South Africa and wind energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite a challenging question to answer, and I don't think I'll offer a particular view, but I mean, I think there's various studies, I think, that's been done over the last couple of years, from indicating 80 gigawatts of wind capacity. I think we've seen the last renewable energy grid survey that was done, again indicating large volumes of wind that's available for closing over the next couple of years. Yeah, I think it's not a clear answer at this stage. However, I think just coming back to some of I think your previous question and also comments that Bernard made was, there's quite a large volume of projects sitting in the Cape regions that are, high maturity projects. I don't want to call all of them shovel ready, but close to shovel ready. That is unable to reach financial close due to the inability to evacuate from the grid. And I think, unfortunately, although we've got significant grid capacity in other areas, such as Mpumalanga, Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, if you look at the latest GCCA, the challenge remains that those have not been high priority development areas due to, I think, numerous reasons. It doesn't always have the best wind resource. There's more environmental challenges. There's mining operation challenges, and developing a wind farm takes anything from 3 to 10 years to from starting to actually being able to reach financial close. So I think the challenge with the existing grid constraints and developers having to move into these new areas, the reality is that it will take a couple of years before those projects actually reach maturity, and is able to to reach financial close and deliver power to the grid. From a technology perspective, I think the technology already exists in the market to manage lower wind resource areas. So from a wind turbine technology perspective, there's no real limitation or constraint. It's simply a matter of timing, and I think the ability of these projects to reach the right level of maturity. So unfortunately, many projects that are mature in the Capes that are stranded, and it will take a couple of years for the non-constrained grid areas to fully develop those projects to maturity.
Yeah, thanks, Compton. No, I think that balance is important. Mamiki, maybe next for you. From an Actim perspective, we've spoken about the grid, we've spoken about the activity that needs to take place. But when you look at Actim specifically and your production capacity, are you expanding in the areas of transmission and distribution products and transformers, etc.? Is that part of the strategy of Actim in South Africa?
Paul, yes, currently, so we currently have two divisions that we that are currently supplying, especially to the TDP. For instance, our high voltage division currently, or at least since the RIP 2011, has supplied equipment to about 80 to 90% of all the grid-tied projects. So that particular division is currently doing an exercise as there's when we look at the TDP, the upcoming TDP, and all the IPP that still have to be connected to the grid, we believe that there's an opportunity for about 40% increase in capacity. And on the distribution transformers from our side, we have excess capacity, so there isn't a need for expansion in that space. And on the step-up transformers, we also are meeting current demand, except in higher classes of transformers where we're actually not participating at the moment. But we do believe that there's opportunity to partner with international partners to at least look at local assembly. So yes, it's a mix of different products that go into the next infrastructure projects that some have. There's a real need for expansion, and whereas in some others there is excess capacity.
Thanks, Mamiki. Vaughan, just sticking with this, issues around the grid and there is this concept of the interim grid capacity allocation rules that each IPP needs to be cognizant of. Perhaps it's fairly technical. Perhaps you can unpack it for us and what the challenges around that are.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, the introduction, well, as we know, the introduction of the interim grid capacity allocation rules goes back several lengthy period. And there have been some, I think, significant developments, particularly following the June 2023 enactment, I'll call it, of these rules. The rules then, as we know, they've developed to a point, and I think the starting point change in philosophy from a first come, first serve to the move from the first come, first serve to a first ready, first served principle, which I think ensures that there will be, or it's envisaged to be, a loosening of the bottleneck through through the application of that principle. The rules themselves, I think, then are informed largely by that shift in philosophy. And we saw in November 2023 an engagement that has resulted in several amendments to these rules. And as it currently stands, to the best of my knowledge, the rules are in the finalization or concretization process as we speak. So I think there's going to be a significant unbottling of the availability of shovel-ready projects getting into the grid, obviously subject to constraints within the grid itself. The rules themselves are, as I say, the amendments to rules themselves. There are a couple of significant points that haven't changed, and I'm going to go through the evaluation criteria, particularly for that we have now introduced through the new amendments. And these, as I say, haven't changed, I don't believe, hugely in form and substance, but I think are definitely clarified to a greater extent. The need for environmental consents and all environmental consents and necessary authorizations, particularly in respect of water use licenses, in respect of that the generation facility, still needs to be in place. The requirements to have the water use license available and in hand, as well as the Civil Aviation Authority approvals, these have been relaxed with IPPs, who now only required to demonstrate that they have applied for these licenses. Power purchase agreement, heads of terms, these need to be duly signed with end users of the power or licensed energy trader, and confirmation from the off-taker that the appointments are in place. There's also been the requirements surrounding land use permission for construction of projects has also been relaxed. And although IPPs are required to own or have a lease with the landowner in place prior to Eskom issuing a budget quote, the IPPs will no longer be disqualified from securing that connection budget quote if permission to subdivide land for non-agricultural use has not yet been secured. And that, I think, is a significant move in the direction of unbottling what were before and what still remain onerous requirements, but necessary requirements. Then the requirements for IPPs to show 2 years of measured data for wind farm sites and 1 year for solar has also been relaxed. And that again is significant in that the IPPs are now only required to show 1 year of measured data for wind and provide satellite data for solar PV projects, provided, of course, that this data is obtained from a reputable source. Then, in terms of the, we started off, Paul, you asked me about the grid, the guarantees. The applicants are still required to furnish Eskom with a grid capacity allocation guarantee. And these are, this guarantee is to be issued by a financial institution approved by Eskom immediately following confirmation of the project, that the project meets all other criteria. There are still negotiations, and amendments are still under negotiation. In respect to the guarantee, and I'd like to come back to this guarantee because we have a significant overlap of guarantees in terms of the construction works projects and the self-build, particularly in the event of self-build agreements, and the grid capacity allocation guarantee. And I think that the requirements of the guarantees are typical, and I'm sure that the majority of IPPs would be familiar with these guarantees. So in as much as the rules do are, and I think to a significant degree, are relaxed, the requirements that these guarantees be submitted, I think, are going to be fixed. And I don't believe that that's an encumbrance. But as I said at the outset, I do think this informs particularly two other issues, in my view, that go more to the nuts and bolts of realizing this, the grid connections, of realizing this increase in supply generation, and indeed even in transmissions. The nuts and bolts I'm talking to are besides the available capacity. So, for example, in the transmission sector, in terms of local capacity, there are very few local contractors with the capacity any longer to construct the transmission lines that we're going to require, which is itself a huge constraint and I think a significant challenge. But more on a nuts and bolts level in terms of the contracting necessity that this type of on-demand, the philosophy that informs the need for an on-demand guarantee, in my experience, I think is also to a degree a constraint that we've got to address. And that is not only in terms of the contracting strategies that apply, and I'm there talking in broadly to the adversarial strategies that I believe are currently the traditional way of Eskom engaging the IPPs and its other contractors. And also, in my experience with these contracts, is the implementation, the practical implementation of their terms. And I think together with what we're seeing in the bigger picture, I think that significant attention should also be focused on these issues. A contract is a contract, and it's really only as good as the implementers. And also the strategy that informs both the implementation and the terms of the contract. And as I say, in my experience, I think that this also is a challenge. I don't think that, the rules aren't intended to address that type of challenge, but do require that the contracts and the necessary engagements that have to happen to create those contracts are in place, and the contract themselves largely dictated to, and the terms are largely dictated. But I do think that as part of the challenge to increase availability and generation capacity, and I think more so when we get to if constructing transmission lines, I think also attention needs to be given and paid to both the contracting strategies and the processes and application for implementation.
Yeah, thanks, Vaughan. And yeah, I mean, partnering in construction, I think that's where we got ahead. But perhaps, Bernard, from the IPP office point of view, sounds like, from all the other panelists, lots of opportunity from a generation perspective, shovel ready or close to shovel ready, but the grid scarcity remains a key issue here. From an IPP office point of view, how do you view that? And particularly as you roll out the program and are dealing with these grid scarcity issues?
Yeah. Paul, I think this is the number one challenge, and I think it's important to put this problem into perspective. From the 19.9 gigawatt that the last GCCA indicated it's available, obviously Cape is zero. We're sitting with zero. About 6 gigawatt of that it's sitting in Northwest Free State and Limpopo, and those are the provinces where we have seen projects in the past. The other 13 gigawatt is in provinces where we have not seen project, because those are low yield areas. That's Gauteng, Mpumalanga, and KZN. So we do have a serious challenge. Obviously, the message to developers is that they need to start moving in those areas to develop the projects. We understand that there are projects that are already near ready in some of those provinces, but we must also understand this will come at a premium for the buyers. Based on our previous bid windows, we have seen up to 30% difference in the tariffs between the Cape region and areas such as Mpumalanga. But yeah, for now, that's what we have. We have to develop projects where the grid is available. I'm just highlighting that, we are moving into that situation where we will start seeing the impact on the overall tariff because of the grid not being available. So our number one focus as a country should be to expedite grid development. If one has to think about load shedding at stage 4 or stage 6, if we are considering renewables to solve this, it means you have to multiply that number by 3 to solve each stage of load shedding. So we need, if one consider the worst case scenario of stage 6, we need about 36 gigawatt of capacity to solve that, and to make sure we have enough excess capacity for maintenance and the like. And grid, as we said earlier, we can only get 19.9 gigawatts. That means we have to expedite grid development. But to answer your question, for projects that are aiming to participate, they have to start looking at provinces outside the Cape area. But I think it's important to also mention what has happened in the last year. That is the curtailment work that Eskom, has been facilitating in the last year. And I understand the studies have been done. So that 4 gigawatt, the sooner it gets released to the market, the better, so that we can at least get some of those projects that are ready in the Cape region to participate in the programs. But yeah, certainly grid remains a concern for us. Yeah. And we are also working with Eskom to make sure we can expedite that process.
And have influence on the TDP where you can, I assume. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks, Bernard. So we've spoken a lot about constraints, challenges, but let's talk about what we really need to do as South Africans, and that's execution and enablement, and particular in South Africa. So I'll go through the panelists back to Francia. Mamiki, from an Actum perspective, and private sector very active in this space, skills and the capacity locally to assist in the generation, the transmission, and the distribution systems. What's your view as Actum, and what do you see needs to be done and is being done to increase our capacity in South Africa?
Thanks, Paul, for that question. I think our view as Actum is that we're looking at skills in relation to sustainability of the manufacturing sector. So what we're currently doing at this moment, we're investing about 15 million rand in an artisan training center, where we're focusing on electrical, mechanical, and boiler making and welding. And I believe those of us who remember the times of Medupi and Kusile will remember the welding skills availability drama that happened, especially in Medupi. So we continue to invest in that. And I think another thing that maybe I think has been under the radar that I think, meaning as a collective, we need to start looking at that. And I remember that Bernard would correct me if I'm wrong, that with the IPPs, one of the requirements is for them to set up community trusts. And I think my belief is that those community trusts were also used to train people within a certain vicinity of power plants that are being built. And I think we need to continue to, this program has been in the running from 2011. So we need to try to collectively look at where those skills are and reactivate that process. Because when you look at, we're hoping that the draft IRP indicates that for once industry will start looking at consistency. And I think the private sector has been crying that with the stop-start that we've seen in the IPP, we want to invest, and that means also investing in skills. But we're hoping that going forward, we'll probably have almost a smoothened demand profile that will allow for consistent investment in skills and capacity.
Thanks, Mamiki. I remember the world situation, Madubi.
Yeah, you were probably still at Eskom then.
So, Compton, to you as well. Lots spoken about wind, Eastern Cape, Western Cape. But from a solutioning point of view and from a positivity point of view, how are you looking at it, and what more can be done, certainly through the private sector, to really make this plan happen?
Yeah, thanks. I think we have to be thinking in the context of, large volumes of procurement. If we remain at low levels of procurement, I don't think there are such significant challenges. We can continue as is. But it's really, I think, in the context where we've got a significant uptake in renewables, where I think it introduces, quite a number of challenges and opportunities which we need to be managing, right? So I think just from a skills perspective, I think just from the experience over the last 12 months in the market, where there's been some movement with projects reaching financial close, construction starting. We're already seeing quite significant challenges in finding people that's available. I think to participate in the various stages of developing, closing, and constructing projects. Especially from a Nordics perspective as an EPC, surely in the availability of construction professionals, we see quite a significant challenge in finding people in South Africa with the requisite experience and qualifications. I think there was obviously this long hiatus we had between bid window 3 and 4. We lost a lot of skills to the international market. We continue to see us losing skills to the international market. So I think if we get to the multi gigawatts of wind and solar being developed and procured on an annual basis, we'll certainly see challenges. I think whether it's lawyers, engineers, business development professionals, construction professionals. This is going to be a challenge which I think as a country we'll have to understand in terms of how we go about managing those. Then I think just on the project execution side, again, I think it's been quite interesting over the last couple of months where in the private space we've seen these large volumes of procurement happening, either projects reaching financial close or in process of reaching financial close over the next couple of months. And obviously we've got some of the previous bid window projects also still in execution activity. So when you start looking at what's coming over the next 24 months, where you've got 2 to 3 gigawatts of wind projects in execution, and these projects often align in terms of the execution schedule. This introduces quite a lot of interesting dynamics which we've not had to deal with in the past. Because I think from the local market perspective is once you have a limited number of ports that can deal with wind turbine components coming in, we've got challenges in port congestion. We see challenges with the availability of storage close to port. We see challenges with police escorts not being available in the large numbers that they are needed to support the evacuation of these components from the ports to sites. And again, that's linked to some of the outdated guidelines that we have, like the TRH11 for abnormal loads. That's not really catered for our industry. And then, the availability of large cranes remains quite a big challenge, right? So the stop-start nature of our industry has not been beneficial, to the crane contracting market. We often have to import these cranes from overseas, so it's we all carry the cost of doing the mobilization and demobilization of these large cranes, and it introduces a whole lot of risk in execution if you have one of these cranes breaking down during execution, and it could take a couple of weeks or months to find an additional crane. So I think those are some of the challenges we're seeing in execution, and I don't think any of these are not solvable. I think again, visibility on pipeline of projects and execution. I think more engagement between all the various stakeholders as an industry. So whether it be the IPPs, key contractors, wind OEMs, actually collaborating more, creating visibility of what's coming so that we can better manage that. better alignment and engagement with various government departments, and specifically for us, the Department of Transport and ports authorities, and again, openness from government to consider, adapting or changing guidelines like DRH11 for abnormal loads. So so again, positivity, and we're seeing procurement happening, introducing new challenges, which I think we just have to work together and find ways to solve them.
Yeah, thanks, Compton. And scale, and as you say, pipeline will help a lot, when you get certainty.
Exactly.
So, Vaughan, the next one for you. You spoke a lot about these contractor challenges, and it's just the commercial aspects of construction and guarantees. Whether you're on FIDIC or NEC or in any of those conditions of contract. But so how do you unlock it? How do you get better partnering between Eskom, the contractors, the requirements? In your view, is there a better way? And away from a South African perspective, we can better solve, the conditions of contract, because they are adversarial, as you rightfully pointed out.
Thanks, Paul. I do believe that there's a move internationally, which I think that we might be perhaps lagging a bit behind. And for me, the sad thing is that in this in South Africa, and certainly going back 15, 20 years, I think that we were better at it then than we are now. And that is that the sense that this partnering requires a relatively large degree of maturity in relations and managing relations, and that's built up over a time. And that, in my experience, has been a sort of a bridge too far for us. And I think that certain of the contract forms are reflecting a more realistically and attainable process, and that is, and it's perhaps an imprecise word, but we see it in the most recent FIDIC form, the most recent NEC form, and we will also be seeing it to a degree in our local GCC conditions of contract, and that is towards a cooperation. And the cooperation is fostered through the agreement, through the terms of the contract itself. And this leads to contracts, construction contracts, seemingly becoming more project management tools than contracts in the strict sense of it. But I do believe that with a sense of cooperation that we're seeing, and I think Compton was mentioning it on just in terms of the practicalities of getting a turbine from A to B. I think if we focus on the ability that we have to cooperate, I think that would go a long way to freeing up at least the commercial side of contracting. And I think that without that being in place, and without that sense of cooperating, not only in terms of the contracting strategies, but the contracting implementation itself, and that cooperation being fostered through the terms of the contract, I think that we'll see some really good and substantial steps in the direction that we need to be in. And it's not unattainable.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Vaughan, 100% right. I think we have fallen backwards. I agree with that comment. So before I get James to sort of give a last overall positive view, because James started off very positively. Bernard, just from the IPP office point of view, what's your horizon over the next 6 months and 9 months? Are you well capacitated? You ready to unlock everything that needs to get unlocked? Are you positive that these REAP programs can be rolled out?
Well, I think we from the IPP office are ready as it can be. You saw the bid window 7 storage and battery 7.6 gigawatt that we released in December. And the plan is to close the REAP and battery storage now in April, and then by December, we want this project to reach financial close, and then they move into construction for 2 years, over the next 2 years. We also have 1.7 gigawatt of projects that are now in construction phase that we are monitoring to make sure that they reach their commercial operation. So 5 of those 14 projects will reach commercial operation by the end of this year. And we also have another 1.3 gigawatt of PV from bid window 6 and battery storage 1 that are currently preparing for commercial close between March and June this year. So we are hard at work. And then in the horizon, we also, in the near future, obviously, given the availability of the grid, we have another 1,000 megawatts of gas dedicated for Kucha that we are now ready to issue the RFQ. And then we've got bid window 8, another 5 gigawatt that will follow very much the drafting on bid window 7. That's also imminent. And then we also have another battery storage 616 megawatts that should be released in the next couple of months as well. So that's what we are looking at in the next 6 months to a year. And obviously, and anything and everything that can be sent our way will be released. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. And James, really over to you. Do you believe we have the enabling environment? Do you believe we're improving? You know, you started off really positively, landing some positive messages here. We obviously will still have load shedding in the foreseeable future. But are you seeing private sector, governments, and all the players having a closer collaboration here to make it happen?
No, thanks, Paul. Maybe also just in reference to, I think, the points that Vaughan and Crompton have made about engagement and cooperation. And again, goes to my earlier point, not to take away from, I think, the often lack of confidence and distrust in the overall system and the impact of, you know, Bernard's mentioned COVID. And load shedding has been, you know, from a societal perspective for small businesses, has been absolutely debilitating. So it's very difficult to just come out and say, well, things are new and positive and things are all going to happen, because it's not that easy. That said, I mean, even all the relaxations that Vaughan referred to in IG card, that was a direct result. Even the legal challenge on the bid windows, or not on the bid windows, on the IG card when it came out, that was a direct result of very open engagement with the grid access unit, some bold decisions made by the leadership there to go, well, we've got better information, we've engaged business, we've now got good banking developer input, and so let's make the adjustments. So I think that the responsiveness, the openness to engage, we've never seen a more engaging government, Eskom, you know, so I think that for me is a very positive thing that we've got to build on. Part of that, though, does come back to load shedding. And I think what I would like to just close off and say is that, you know, we've seen this historic downward trend of EAF, roughly 3% year on year. People like to look at the numbers, you know, so 22 was 58%, 23, 54.7. If we continue on that trajectory of sort of EAF or kind of Eskom performance, there's nothing really that we could do. We can't build renewables and variable energy quick enough to compensate for that. We will be stuck with load shedding for a very long time. And I think that's also, again, comes through in the IRP. So to build trust, to turn this thing around at a societal level, to say we've got business confidence, investment confidence, and that we are going to be able to move forward, we do need to have an understanding that, can we solve load shedding? Then can we mobilize investment? And is this investment in the interest of all South Africans? And I think there again, from a partnership perspective, you know, the president has personally championed this. He meets with business and all the ministers every 6 weeks in person. Now, that's quite unique globally to have that level of commitment, of engagement. I think that if we also look at within NECOM Workstream 1, the Eskom turnaround under Beki Khumalo, I think he's doing a marvelous job. I think Eskom are doing a really fantastic job. And again, we know where it's come from, a very low base, but they're really focusing on where the important issues and impacts that we can make technically. How do we also deal with procurement issues, people issues, etc. So they have a sort of a technical recovery program that should be able to bring back sort of 2.5 gigs in 2024. Not all of that's going to happen, and there are always other risks. But I think already from September last year, we've seen very much a flattening of that EAF upward trajectory in 2023. I mean, my numbers tell me that sort of year on year from September till now, we year on year doing better in 23 than we were in 22 on EAF performance. And all of the modeling that I referred to earlier have really kind of landed on a scenario that says, as long as EAF doesn't decline, and we keep on the investment programs, the reform programs, and we keep that collaboration engagement, we will be able to, from a societal perspective, end load shedding by the end of 2024. That puts us in a position where I think, as Crompton has referenced, we've got to build those skills, build more innovation, agility, and we've really got to then step up on delivery. But we do need a capable state. We need the IPP office, we need big public auctions, we need Eskom, we need NERSA, we need DMRE, we need to engage in the IRP. So I think sometimes we also have to kind of realize that we have to engage openly in a positive way. It's not always going to be easy. We're not always going to get the sort of the business or commercial output that we are specifically looking for. But I think there's been very well demonstrated. And even at the moment, we've got business teams sitting in the energy action kind of work groups over this 3 days, engaging on really important issues. Eskom, IPP office, NERSA are there making concessions and saying, how do we get things done? So there is a sense of urgency and action, and I think we have to take that at face value and engage in that in a constructive way. But the opportunity is there. Thanks, Paul.
No, thanks, James. 100%. And I'm glad you ended up that. From my perspective, security of supply is the #1 issue, and all parties have to act together to get this. This is not about a long-term strategy where we've got security of supply issues. We have to address those. We all have to work together to get it done. So to end off, I really want to thank the panelists and thank for your forthright answers, and thanks to the audience. We've been reading the questions. I think we have, some of them are very specific, so obviously we didn't want to cover those, but I think in general we've given you some food for thought, and I think we've covered some of those questions. So I'd like to again thank the panelists and hand over to Shannon.
Thanks so much, Paul. That brings us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to say thank you to our facilitator, Paul O'Flaherty, for enabling a robust and engaging discussion on the important topic of South Africa's energy industry. Thank you also to our panelists, James Mackay from the Energy Council of South Africa, Vaughan Hutting from MDA Attorneys, Bernard Magoro from the IPP Office, Compton Saunders from Nordex, and Mamiki Matlawa from Actim. We really appreciate you taking the time to join this panel. A big thank you to our sponsors, EY Parthenon, MDA Attorneys, Nordex, Actim, Sungro, and NG for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join this discussion on South Africa's energy outlook, where the panel unpacked what we can expect regarding Eskom's restructuring, new generation investment, grid expansion, and strategies for local content. Our next webinar takes place on Wednesday, 28 February at 2 p.m. and focuses on ways to improve legacy planning and security in South African mining. The link to register for that webinar was shared in the chat. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach me at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time, and goodbye.